There, I want to talk today about the symptoms of growing up with a narcissistic mother. And this is different than the signs that your mother is a narcissist. We're talking now about how this shows up in you. So, what it looks like when you've been raised by a narcissistic mother, how that impact on you shows up. So, the effects on you. These are the symptoms I'm talking about. And I've got 16 of them. And believe it or not, this is not an exhaustive list. You can probably think of more, and you might not have all of these. You may have some of them. You may have others that are not on my list. But I've gathered 16, and I'm going to go over them with you now. So here are my 16 symptoms or signs that you have been raised by a narcissistic mother. And the first one is poor boundaries. And so when you're raised by a narcissistic mother, as you might know, you are considered an extension of her. So she doesn't see you as a separate person with your own thoughts and feelings and beliefs and an independent individual or someone on their way to being independent. That's not how she views you. You belong to her. And so when you are seen as an extension of someone, that's kind of the antithesis of boundaries because boundaries are what kind of differentiates you from other people. So when you set boundaries, you are basically saying, this is where end and where you begin, and that's healthy. But with your mother, that wasn't allowed. And you probably learned very early that setting boundaries is actually quite dangerous with a narcissistic mother. And even if it didn't get you hit or something physically dangerous, it felt life-threatening because of the fact that she would reject you, she would withdraw love. It just wasn't allowed. And so when you get that message as a child that your primary caregiver is not allowing you to set boundaries and that that's going to result in abandonment and rejection, you extrapolate that to everyone else. So I'm not sure why the mind does this, but that's what we do. We just decide that boundaries are dangerous, period. I'm not going to set them. They're not safe. Often we don't even know what they are because we've never seen them or been allowed to develop them or been taught what they are. So that word, if you're like me, that word may not have even been in your vocabulary until very recently. But there's just a real deathly fear of anyone being unhappy with you or anyone rejecting you. And you're going to avoid that at all costs. So that means it feels safer to go along with what someone else wants than it does to set a boundary. And if you know me or you've been in my community for a while, you may have heard me say that as a teenager, that led to a date rape. So the consequences of this can be dire and they can be very dangerous. So the irony is that we're trying to avoid danger by not having boundaries, but in fact, we are putting ourselves in danger by not having them. So that's number one. Number two is low self-worth. So that is kind of an all-encompassing one where you just don't feel good enough. And there's, in fact, a book on the topic of daughters of narcissistic mothers that's called When Will I Ever Be Good Enough, I believe is the name. And this is kind of a common refrain amongst daughters of narcissistic mothers that we just never feel like we're enough. We have endured a lot of criticism by our primary caregiver. So, whereas healthy mothers would be encouraging their children and praising them and guiding them and all of that, our mothers were competing with us. They were showing us that we didn't matter. They were letting us know that their needs took priority over our needs. And so we just had this general sense that, like, I don't matter. I'm not allowed to have needs and wants. Those are to be pushed down because my mother's needs take precedence and I have to focus on those, and so on. And the criticism that might be constant or the underhanded compliments, backhanded compliments you might have received if your mother was more covert. These all contribute to just a feeling that I'm not good. I'm always trying to prove that I'm good. And I do that by overgiving, trying to be the bigger person, all of these things that just result in self-abandonment. And you might also be in the world kind of working below your capability. So you might be earning less than you deserve. You might be working at a job that is, you're under or you're overqualified for because you just feel like I don't deserve better than this. And it really does affect every aspect of your life because in order to get what we want, we have to go for what we want and we have to believe we deserve it. So if at a very root level, you just don't believe that you deserve anything because you're not good enough, then of course you're not going to have the life that you want. And then number three is that you have a harsh inner critic. So basically, this is the voice of your mother that you have internalized and it's become your own inner voice. So really, you are speaking to yourself and treating yourself the same way that your mother did. And part of you might believe that you have to do this in order to get anything done. So you might think if I'm too nice to myself, I will drop the ball. If I want to be disciplined, I have to be mean to myself. And this is, in fact, kind of common in the world, even among people who have not endured this kind of abuse, that the inner critic is somehow helping us. But really, just this is just the echo of your mother, and you have just heard this so much, and the child in you believes it because it was safer to believe that perhaps there's something wrong with you or you're a bad kid, you have to shape up and all of this kind of stuff, instead of believing the truth that there was actually something wrong with your mother. And then, so that's number three. Number four is that you have visibility issues. And what we're referring to here is the fear of being seen. So it's likely that you feel very unseen, very unknown, very unheard. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you are hiding. So if, for instance, you have a job that requires you to speak in order to get ahead, and in a meeting or what have you, or to do a presentation, and you avoid that at all cost. So of course you're going to miss out on the opportunities of speaking and presenting and all of that stuff, and that's one of those things that can really hold you back. Or if, say, you're an entrepreneur and going online, whether it be social media or recording a YouTube video like this, and you just don't want to do it, that obviously is going to hold you back a lot. People aren't going to get to know you. They're not going to know what you're capable of. They're not going to know what you do, and you're not going to get clients. So once again, this is going to hurt you not only, emotionally, mentally, and so on. It's literally affecting your quality of life because you're not going to have the same income that you would have if you were putting yourself out there. And so these visibility issues can go really deep. It's a real fear of being seen because that also feels dangerous. The same as setting boundaries, being seen feels dangerous. Saying, I want to be looked at, I want to be noticed, can feel terrifying. And so you kind of do the opposite. And you might have to go back pretty far into childhood to understand where this started. And for me, it was back when I was a toddler. And again, if you know me, you may have heard this story already. But when I was like about two or so, I was trying to get my mother's attention while she was talking on the phone. And instead of, telling me to wait or attending to me or something reasonable, she just suddenly smacked me across the face. And that had such an impact on me that from that moment on and for the rest of my life until I started doing this healing work, I did everything I could to disappear. So I went from being that child who was very eager for attention and insisting on receiving it. That's why I was bothering my mother so much, to being the child who equated being noticed with literal physical pain and danger. And of course, that goes into your subconscious. You don't logically know why you feel this way, and it can become your identity. Like, I really thought I was the person who preferred to be behind the scenes, who didn't want to, I thought I was a shrinking violet and all of that stuff. And actually, that wasn't true. And there were signs that that wasn't true because other people would notice me. I would always be noticed in ways that showed me that there's something about me that stands out, even though I'm doing everything I can not to. So my true nature was not what I was telling myself that it was in order to stay safe. And I like to stress that it's not about being an introvert or an extrovert. I'm very much an introvert, but that doesn't mean that I want to hide and never be seen and not be visible. Those are two very different things. Number five is relationship struggles. So you probably feel like you attract toxic people everywhere. So you might realize now that you know what a narcissist is, that it's not only your mother. You have dated narcissists. You might be married to one now. Your boss at work is a narcissist. You attract narcissistic friends. Or if they're not like clinically narcissistic, perhaps just very toxic, very selfish, don't care about your needs, all of that kind of stuff. Maybe you're always the listener and they're always using you as a sounding board. Maybe the minute you say what you want, they are attacking you and calling you selfish. Like whatever it is, these people are really emulating the mother and the family system that you come from. So they're just mirroring to you kind of what you expect and what you settle for because that's what you've been conditioned to do. So that's just an example of how having a narcissistic mother can prime you to have relationship struggles. And in fact, one of the symptoms of complex PTSD in general, so that's basically childhood trauma, that is relationship struggles. That is one of the big ones. Number seven is that you overgive in relationships. So that is, in fact, one of the struggles, but you're also overgiving in order to try and prove yourself. So you don't believe in the self-worth that we already talked about. You don't believe that you are worthy of more. You don't believe that you are worthy of a give and take. You feel like you always have to be giving more because that's what you are used to. You're kind of trying to validate or justify even your right to exist. And you don't believe that just by being, just the fact that you are is enough and that you are enough. You don't have to do anything to be enough. You're always trying to prove yourself, and you do a lot of that by giving, never saying no, having these uneven relationships where it's not give and take, where you're being used and taken advantage of a lot of the time. And that just feels natural to you. And because of that energy that you give off, other people might think it's natural too. Like they might just expect it from you. And you might notice that when you start to change and you start to say no and set those boundaries, that a lot of people in your life won't like it. And even though you're kind of doing the same thing that they do all the time, they just won't accept it with you because it's this pattern they've become used to. So that's why when you start to change in these ways, a lot of those people will weed themselves out of your life. And that is, in fact, a good thing. Number eight is emotional dysregulation. This is another big symptom of childhood trauma in general and daughters of narcissistic mothers specifically. And this goes back to the fact that you were never allowed to have your honest emotions. You were in charge of managing your mother's emotions. That's the parentification there, just an example of it that your emotions weren't supported, they weren't allowed. It was always about managing your mother's, tiptoeing, walking on eggshells so she wouldn't go off like a bomb, caring or catering to her when she was upset about something, always abandoning your own needs emotionally in order to take care of hers, because again, that is what kept you safe. So, as a result of being forced to stuff down these emotions, they become very dysregulated. First of all, because you never had any guidance or support around these emotions. You were never taught how to handle emotions. They become very scary. These emotions were rejected by the people whose support you needed the most. And so you had nowhere to turn with them. And so the most likely thing is that you would avoid them, you would run away from them, you would find them very scary. And you might continue to do that as an adult. So if you maybe give yourself a lot of pep talks instead of admitting disappointment, that was my modus operandi. Anytime I faced something disappointing, I would say, oh, it's not that bad, instead of actually feeling it. And I realized that was a symptom of my childhood trauma because no one was there to help me with my disappointment. So self-compassion was one of the things that actually taught me how to process all my emotions, and that the emotions themselves are not to be feared. It's just that we fear the reaction to our emotions, and we forget that now we're adults and we're allowed to feel whatever we want, and that emotions themselves won't kill you. It's the fear of what will happen if you feel them because you've never allowed yourself to do this. It's the unknown. So the trick is to feel your emotions and soothe yourself through them. And I always recommend EFT tapping as a way to do this. It's one of those nervous system regulation techniques that allows you to feel your emotions, process them without being flooded by them or without allowing them to overwhelm you. And you can use self-compassion practices such as, not minimizing or overblowing your emotions, but just accepting them as they are and not seeing them as good or bad. They just are. And whatever you feel is okay. And if you're emotionally dysregulated, which you probably are, if you're here or you have been, triggers are a big thing for you. So that outsized reaction to something relatively small, or the reaction that actually isn't to do directly with the thing that just happened, it's actually an unprocessed emotion or trauma from your past. So you want to go back and find that time when that happened, possibly for the first time, and see if you can close the loop on that trauma with some inner child healing and validating that younger self who didn't have anyone to help her through whatever she was feeling at the time. So now you get to be that parent to yourself. And this is number 8. The world feels like a very scary place. And this is just a general sense, perhaps, of dread. You might have this feeling of always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop or having this low level anxiety all the time. You might even have panic attacks. Just the feeling that the world or the universe is not on your side. A lot of catastrophizing, a lot of fear around what might happen, needing to know the outcome because you can't trust that things will unfold for you in a good way. One of the things I say now that I'm healed is that everything's always working out for me. But back when I was unhealed, I felt like the opposite. I felt like everything was against me. And so when you're in that state, you're actually attracting more of that. So if you notice like a lot of calamity in your life, it could be, and this is not blaming at all, it's just what happens. It could be because you're putting out that energy of everything's against me, the world doesn't love me, all of that stuff. And number 9 is feeling empty or hopeless. And this is the sense that you don't have any power to change your situation. And I see this a lot with my clients when they're early in their recovery, is this sense that there's nothing I can do about this. I'm just stuck with this. Nothing ever changes. There's nothing I can do. And the reason you feel like that is because when you were a child, you were trapped in the home. You really didn't have any choice. You didn't have any power. But now you do have power as an adult. You have access to resources and support that you didn't, and even mindset that you didn't when you were a child. But somehow the adult sometimes doesn't realize that. So you have an inner child that's unhealed and is still believing that lie that I can't do anything about this. I'm stuck with this. Nothing ever changes for me. There's nothing I can do. And a lot of that too goes back to the boundaries, like you can't say no. With the holidays coming up, for example, if you always are doing things you don't want to do at Christmas time, say, you want to start, challenging yourself on that. Do you believe that there's nothing I can do about this? When in fact, it will be difficult and people will get mad at you possibly, but you're an adult now and you can change it. You just have to use some of the tools that I help you with on this channel and in my courses and so on, to make those changes slowly in a way where you're still protecting your nervous system and you're not kind of diving into the deep end, but you are able to start affecting that change so you don't feel so hopeless and helpless. And even crying sometimes can be an example of that. There's such a difference between the healthy crying that is just the release of an adult who needs an emotional, expression, and the child who is being helpless, the crying of the inner child who is wounded and who is just crying because they don't know what else to do. And you want to be mindful of that too. And number 10 is feeling like no one understands you. So it's likely that you feel very misunderstood. And part of that is because people don't understand. You might have tried to tell even your friends about what's going on with you, with your mother and your family, and they don't get it. They say things like, oh, but that's your mother, or my family's crazy too, or what have you. And I've had that, and I know now who to tell and who not to tell, or to just take it with a grain of salt if someone doesn't get it. I'm no longer triggered by that. But I've had people say to me, oh, yeah, our family fights all the time. When in fact, fighting can be a sign of healthy communication because you're actually expressing your honest emotions. And that's not always true, but it can be. And in this case, I sense that that was the case. And it's like, no, I'm not talking about fighting. I'm actually talking about not being allowed to say anything, not being allowed to express any honest thoughts or emotions, always having to wear a mask, always having to play a role in your family. The moment you step outside of that role, there's a huge punishment and backlash and even rejection and abandonment and so on. So people don't understand that. So what we do is to avoid the re-traumatization of telling someone and having them not get it. What we do is we start to shut down. We stop telling the truth about who we are. We might start to kind of lie a little bit about what's going on or just not share it because we're trying to fit in. And so when we do that, we are not allowing ourselves to be all of who we are. And again, of course, we have to read the room. Of course, we have to know when it's appropriate, what's appropriate, how much to tell, who to tell. People have to earn our trust before we tell them anything about our families and so on. But at a root level, if you're feeling shame around your mother or what's going on in your family, that's a sign that this feeling misunderstood is causing you to kind of maybe pretend to be something you're not, or minimize yourself, or kind of shut yourself down to fit into whatever, circle that you're in. And this just kind of accentuates the feeling of being misunderstood. And as a result, you're never going to find your people if you keep on kind of pretending to be something you're not. So if you're around people who don't get it and you're trying to pretend to be like them, how are you ever going to be known for who you are? How are you ever going to be seen and understood if you're pretending to be something you're not, or pretending to have a family system that you don't, and so on? And number 11 is that you have difficulty forming close relationships. And this is a result of many things. It could be a fear of intimacy. It could be that you share too much too soon. It could be that you withdraw and you don't share enough because you're avoiding those emotions. So when someone shares something with you, you're not able to reciprocate. Or if you are vulnerable with someone else, you're too vulnerable and then you get hurt because they're not ready to reciprocate that back to you. if you get into a relationship with someone, you might not be able to express your thoughts, your emotions, your wants, your needs, and so they don't know who you are or what you need from them, and so they can't give it to you, and so you feel that emptiness that I was sharing earlier, except you're in a relationship, and it's in your close relationships, especially romantic ones, where you're supposed to feel that feeling of being understood and fulfilled on some level. And of course, you don't want to get all your fulfillment from that, but on a certain level, you should feel like a real connection with the person that you're in relationship with. And this trauma that we've been through can make that very difficult because the lack of trust in ourselves, the lack of trust in other people, the lack of understanding on how to build intimacy. So you may not know that there's a dance of intimacy. So it requires baby steps. It's like I give a little more, then you share a little more. And, I then we go deeper to the next level of sharing, and then you open up a little bit more. And some of us don't understand that, and we just blah, vomit everything out on the first date or very, very early in the relationship. It's too much for the other person, and then we are hurt again. And it could be that, that's like the anxious attachment style, or it could be the more avoidant, where you're just not willing to open up. Like, even if it's been a little while and they have earned your trust, you just can't go there. So, both of those things could be going on. And number 12 is a feeling of disconnection or disassociation, even. And this could be a feeling of like numbing out. So it's kind of the opposite of hyperarousal. Possibly it's like hypoarousal. So where instead of being on high alert, you kind of feel a little dulled out, numbed out. You might have the feeling like you're not really there, you don't really feel real, you're kind of looking at yourself from outside of yourself. And I've had a client describe it to me as, once she was driving and she was so surprised that another car, like someone in another car, noticed her. I think they waved her to go through a stop sign or something. And she was so having this feeling of like not existing that it surprised her to see that someone else saw her because that was the proof that she actually exists. So that's just an example of how far this kind of disaffection, disassociation, disconnection from yourself and from the world can go. And that's definitely a symptom of growing up with a narcissistic mother. Because, again, like you had to disconnect from yourself sometimes to survive because the pain of what you were going through was so great. And number 13 is suicidal thoughts or ideation. And I went through this myself, and that is just what it sounds like. I don't have to go into that too much further. If you've been there, it is just kind of the darkest place that you can be, the feeling that there really is no point in going on anymore. And number 14 is hyperarousal. So kind of the opposite of that hypoarousal I was talking about being really numbed out and not feeling anything. Hyperarousal is the feeling of being on high alert all the time, in a state of high anxiety and easily startled and, going through life, with your shoulders up around your ears and just like you're kind of like a raw nerve all the time. And it's just deeply uncomfortable. It's very exhausting. And it's just a sense that if someone kind of touches you, you jump, and any kind of loud noise is just going to rattle you and set you off for a much longer time than it should. It takes you forever to come back down to baseline. You feel like you're always like way up here instead of, down here where you should be. It's deeply uncomfortable, and it's not actually where I normally live. I was always more on the hypoarousal side, but I have experienced those symptoms of like if a fire truck goes by, that it just rattles me so much and it takes me so long to get back to baseline, which is really not healthy or normal. It is a sign that you have been through some trauma and your nervous system has trouble regulating itself. And number 15 is perfectionism. And this comes out of the fear of making mistakes, obviously. It comes out of the need to be perfect because anything less is not good enough. And that again comes from all the criticism you got, your mother giving you the message that you were never good enough, this desire to please because you feel like it's your job to make other people happy. The last one I'm going to talk about, number 16, is fear of criticism or overreactivity to criticism, and that ties into the perfectionism. So number 15 is the perfectionism, having to do everything right, never allowing yourself to make mistakes. That fear of making mistakes again goes back to childhood when you didn't feel like you had any room for that because if you weren't perfect, you weren't good enough, you weren't redeemable, you didn't allow yourself to exist if you weren't perfect. And then you might open yourself up to criticism. So criticism, you might notice, is anathema to someone who's grown up in a narcissistic home. And that's because you feel as though when someone criticizes you, you feel as though you're no good. Like you feel it's almost like a death. And I can remember that. Even any kind of feedback, you'll do anything not to have to receive any kind of negative feedback. And what we see here is just this complete lack of growth. So when you're in this trauma state, when you're in this state of survival where any kind of criticism or feedback, and add to that the need to be perfect is going on, how are you ever going to grow? Because we didn't learn that actually being perfect is not desirable because you need to make mistakes in order to get anything done in this world that's worth doing. You need to make mistakes. They are good because that's how you learn how to do it better the next time. It's how you grow. And feedback, maybe you need to hear that. You know, we have trouble discerning between the fact that some feedback is actually, we might want to hear it. It's an opportunity to self-reflect. It's an opportunity to do better in a certain area. But if we conflate that with the kind of criticism that our mother always gave us, which was so detrimental to us and which felt like a type of death, it was like being stabbed in the heart every time. That's why we can't stand any type of criticism. We can't tell the difference. And so that's another part of growing up and out of this wounded inner child is understanding that not all criticism is bad. Some of it is an opportunity to reflect. It's an opportunity to do better next time. And it's not personal. It has nothing to do with you. It's just an offer. You know, it's just an offer of what someone else may have noticed or the way someone else wants things done, especially at work and so on. And perfectionism is just keeping you from that growth, whether it's in your career or in your personal life, your relationships, and so on, that we all need. So, those are my 16 symptoms of growing up with a narcissistic mother. Let me know if you can think of any more in your own life and add it to the comments if you want. And as always, I would love it if you would subscribe to this channel so I can keep on bringing you this content and have it shared widely with many other women who need it. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.